In February 1945, over 700 British bombers were bound for Germany. Their mission was to bomb on an almost defenseless city. The aim was to bring the end of the war within sight by terrorizing civilians. By February 1945, the German Air Force was all but destroyed, and her armies were in full retreat. But the Allied offensive in the west on the ground was making relatively slow progress. Only in the east, where the Russians were still making considerable advances, was there a real prospect of a quick end to the war. It was against this background that Air Marshal Harris took the questionable decision to intensify the air raids on Germany. I do not personally regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bombs of our British grenadiers. It was clear from this that the purpose of the raid was to further sap the morale of the German people by killing thousands of women and children in the infamous destruction of Dresden. As the last waves of British bombers arrived over Dresden, already a flickering glow could be seen lighting up the night sky. The target was obviously burning below them. The planes dropped down through the clouds to make their bombing runs in clear air. Their target lay beneath them, already well ablaze. These were the lights of the murderous firestorm that was destroying the ancient city. For once, everything had been in the bombers' favor. The weather had been just right, and the few remaining night fighters remained grounded through chronic fuel shortages. As the city was not considered to be a military target, there was very little flak cover, so the planes were able to fly much lower than usual, with the result that they dropped their bombs with far greater accuracy. This massive surprise attack caught the ground services unaware, and the fires spread quickly throughout the ancient wooden buildings of the town. As the ferocious flames reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius, they drew in all the surrounding oxygen, and fierce winds began to reach hurricane speeds. Men, women, and children were literally sucked into the fires to be burnt alive. Leaving their target behind as they flew home, the British pilots noticed that the glare from the town was visible for more than 100 miles behind them.
Perhaps as many as 100,000 Germans were killed in a series of raids, 3 or 4 of them in 1 week. The true number simply isn't known because the bodies were simply not recovered. It created an immense firestorm which cremated people to ashes. There was no knowledge at all of how many died. In an earlier firestorm on Hamburg in 1943, the reliable figure is something like 40,000 killed in one raid. At this point, you are talking figures which are approximately around those that were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
This was area bombing at its most effective. The raid was to become one of the most notorious attacks carried out by Bomber Command during the Second World War. The main weight of the attack on Dresden was carried out by the Lancasters of Bomber Command. Over 700 of these aircraft took part in the infamous night attack. The Lancaster, built by AV Rowe Limited, was probably the most famous British bomber used during the Second World War. Its very name has become synonymous with Bomber Command. Ironically, the aircraft was born as a result of failures in an earlier design by the same company.
The Lancaster was greatly superior to its predecessors, to the generation of twin-engine bombers that had preceded it. It was also superior to the four-engine bombers which accompanied it, the Stirling and the Halifax. It was superior because it could carry a much heavier bomb load than most of these aircraft and at a much greater height. It was also sturdy and reliable, a good, dependable aircraft. It also had a very large bomb bay, which meant that it could take specially designed bombs, like the 6-ton tall boy, designed for very accurate bombing. And then finally, at the end of the war, and quite extraordinarily, it could carry the 10-ton Grand Slam bomb, which was an absolutely devastating conventional weapon.
The twin-engine Manchester design had failed to meet the Air Ministry specification against which it had been ordered. The Manchester was clearly outstanding as a bomber design, but it was plagued by the poor performance and unreliability of its twin Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. In 1940, the decision was taken to build a longer span version that could carry 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. So outstanding was the performance of this new design that it was put into immediate large-scale production. Deliveries began in early 1942. From then until the end of the war, they were to fly in every major night bombing sortie of Bomber Command over Germany. They carried a heavier load of bigger bombs than any other aircraft in the European theatre. Their defense armament, with nose, dorsal and tail turrets, enabled them to operate with a reasonable measure of security, even if fighter support was not available. So versatile was the design that they took part in the high-profile raids like the Dambuster raids of 617 Squadron and the area bombing raids on the major German cities. It was tough, and the 4 engines allowed the planes to absorb a great deal of punishment. So it was no surprise that the Lancaster was to become the most famous of British World War II bombers. The success of Bomber Command in World War II had its roots in the First World War. It was there that the use of bombers was seen to be the most effective way in which aircraft could carry the war to the enemy. Although the performance of the aircraft of that time was limited, the potential was there for all to see. And the German Air Force went as far as to launch bombing raids against Britain. But most of the bombing in World War I was concentrated against military targets. Flying behind the immediate front lines, the bombers struck at targets vital to the war effort. The choice of targets included marshalling yards, supply dumps, bridges, and lines of communication. After the First World War, the outrage of the victorious Allies over the German air raids, which had caused considerable civilian casualties, was put to good use in the Versailles Treaty, which forbade Germany from owning an air force. This policy was further strengthened and transformed into an international agreement at a Washington conference on the limitations of armaments in 1922. The final communiqué stated that aerial bombardment for the purpose of terrorizing the civilian population, of destroying or damaging private property not of a military character, or of injuring non-combatants is prohibited. All the major world powers reached an agreement that no attacks were to be made on undefended towns or any other target where civilians might be hit. Sadly, for the citizens of Dresden, those noble sentiments were dead and buried by 1945, but in the early months of the war at least, it did some good. Adherence to the Washington limitations restricted the scope of bomber attacks against civilian targets during the early days of World War II. Initially, both Britain and Germany strictly observed the treaty. In the autumn and winter of 1939, Bomber Command was forced to concentrate its attentions on military targets and German warships at sea or in harbor. Sorties were flown over German cities, including Berlin. But on these missions, the payload was propaganda leaflets, which had little effect other than to provide the aircrews with experience for raids that were made later in the war. The effect of the propaganda was nil.
Bomber Command was scarcely prepared at all to engage Germany in the first months of the conflict. They had very few planes with the range to reach German cities, and they tried attacking German targets in daylight. They went for precise naval targets, the harbour at Kiel, to try to bomb German warships there. They attacked in daylight. They sent about 20 Wellington twin-engine bombers out on 2 raids, and they lost about half of them each time. They found that they did not have the aircraft to attack in daylight. They found that the aircraft very often didn't have the range to penetrate into German targets, and they didn't have very many planes in any case. Bomber Command was not ready for war in 1939.
The first real offensive attacks against ground-based military targets by British bombers were made during the disastrous Norwegian campaign of 1940. In response to the German invasion in the south, an Anglo-French combined force made landings in the north of Norway, and Bomber Command was charged with supporting that invasion. Regular bombing runs were made against the airfields and ports in Norway being used by the Germans to build up their forces. Despite their best efforts, it became clear that the Germans were going to win the battle for Norway. The orders went out for the withdrawal of the Allied forces. With the decision taken, Bomber Command continued to fly sorties to cover the withdrawal. Almost immediately, the surviving aircraft from Norway had to be repositioned for a new campaign. An attack was now expected on the French border, and the border forces in France were in need of reinforcement. Plans had also been agreed for airborne attacks to be made into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. They were designed to cause long-term damage to the Reich's manufacturing base and slow the advance on France. History was to record that this effort was to prove ineffective. The speed and aggression of the German advances threatened to overwhelm the forward airfields of Bomber Command in France. As the British Expeditionary Force fell back on Dunkirk for an orderly withdrawal, the surviving aircraft of Bomber Command retreated to their airfields in England.
Bomber Command's tactics at the beginning of the war were to some extent rooted in the experience of the First World War, because this, after all, was the major source of experience about the effects of bombing. And what had been learned during the First World War, mostly from the Germans, who bombed British cities much more often than the British bombed German cities, you could attack factories and so damage the war effort that way, but that you could also damage the war effort by causing panic and alarm amongst the civilian population. And they caused a great deal of panic in London in 1917. Thousands of people left work for hours on end because there were reported to be bombers overhead. So to some extent they learnt from the First World War. But there was also a great deal of theorising in the interwar period, particularly about the effect of bombs upon morale, and particularly theorising, of course, about the use of gas against the civilian population, which was never actually done, but was indeed expected. And of course in 1939 the British government issued gas masks to all of the British population.
From these bases, they continued to fly missions against German military targets. But it soon became clear that these were not having the desired effect. Restrictions on the range of the aircraft carrying their heavy payloads and the ability of the bombers to find their targets were the major contributors to this inefficiency. It was clear that a new set of tactics had to be found and a new generation of bombers needed to be designed. At the start of hostilities, Bomber Command was dependent on aircraft developed between the wars, the best of which was the Wellington, designed by Vickers Armstrong Limited. It first flew in 1936 and used the unusual geodetic form of aluminium construction, which gave it strength and lightness. There were some design difficulties with the wings, the machine gun nacelles, and the large bomb doors. Although once they were overcome, it became obvious that Vickers had developed an efficient and formidable bomber. Capable of being powered by a variety of different engines, including Rolls-Royce Merlins and Pratt & Whitney Wasps, it produced a maximum speed of 235 miles an hour. It had a service ceiling of 22,000 feet and a maximum service range of 2,200 miles. Fitted with a variety of defensive armament in its twin turrets, it was produced in 16 variants, which were designed to fulfill a variety of roles throughout the war. In all, a total of 11,461 of these outstanding aircraft were produced. The Whitley was a far less successful machine, manufactured by the Armstrong Whitworth Company at its factory in Coventry. It was a rather primitive aircraft of all-metal construction, but at least it had a retractable undercarriage. Powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin X engines, it was capable of a maximum speed of 222 miles an hour. Its typical range was 1,650 miles. Defensive armament was provided by the nose and tail turrets, but its many limitations led to the aircraft being withdrawn from frontline service as soon as a better alternative was developed. One alternative was the Hampton, the last of the new bombers to enter RAF service during the expansion scheme of 1936 to 1938. Manufactured by Handley Page Limited, it was an outstanding aircraft for the early part of the war. It was fast, with a maximum speed of 254 miles an hour, and so maneuverable that the RAF distinguished it as a fighter bomber. The pilot was given a fixed 303 Vickers machine gun for defense. Further defense was provided by 3 movable machine guns mounted in the lower nose for operation by the Navigator bomb aimer. 8 squadrons of Hamptons were in operation in September 1939, raiding naval installations and shipping. Lighter than the Hampton was the Bristol Type 142, the Blenheim, first ordered by the newspaper magnate Lord Rothermere as a fast executive aircraft to carry a pilot and 6 passengers. The completed design was the first modern stressed skin monoplane in Britain, with retractable landing gear and wing flaps. It was later further improved by the fitting of imported American variable pitch propellers. In even greater danger from German fighters was the Fairey Battle, which will always be remembered as the combat aircraft that failed to achieve the promise of its design. When it entered service with the RAF in 1937, it seemed destined to fill a vital niche. However, within 4 years it was being shot out of the sky in droves. It was simply a sitting duck for the new generation of fighters. Within 6 months of that mission, all battles were replaced in frontline units and relegated to a role as training aircraft.
The bombers developed in the interwar years proved to be really rather ineffective. They didn't carry a very heavy bomb load. They had very little in the way of defenses, machine guns to defend them, and their range was pretty inadequate. They were all that the technology of the time could do, however, and of course nobody at the time knew how ineffective they would prove because they had not been tested in action. It was only when they were tested against German defences that it was found that they really were inadequate bombers for attacking German cities in any length.
Despite retreat from France, Bomber Command continued to pursue its primary duty of attacks against military targets. But in August 1940, that role was to change to the bombardment of civilian targets. It happened as a result of a human error. It is now accepted by both sides that the bombs that were dropped by German bombers on London were dropped by mistake, by pilots who had been briefed to bomb Rochester and Thameshaven, and that they had made a genuine human error. However, this error in target location occurred at the very height of the Battle of Britain, and the British response was naturally forceful. On the night of 25th of August 1940, the aircraft of Bomber Command made their first sortie over Berlin in a retaliatory raid for the bombs which had landed on London.
Sometimes thought that the Germans made this switch in response to British bombing of Berlin. I don't think that explanation particularly holds water, because the raid on Berlin was on the 25th of August, and yet the attack on London was not till a fortnight later, on the 7th of September. I think that the reasons why the Germans switched from attacking airfields, which was punishing Fighter Command quite heavily, to attacking London, which was not such a direct way of attacking Fighter Command, was because Goering believed that Fighter Command was on its last legs. He believed the claims of British aircraft shot down by his pilots, claims which were made in all honesty, showed that Fighter Command was very nearly wiped out. He therefore thought, let's get rid of it in one big attack upon a target which it must rise to defend, that is to say, London. We will destroy it by forcing them to come into the air and attack. In point of fact, of course, the claims made by his fighter pilots had been exaggerated. Fighter Command was in much better shape than it was thought, and the Germans suffered a considerable reverse.
The British raid caused outrage in Berlin. But Bomber Command's first bombing raid on the German capital was considered to have had little military success. Only 29 crews claimed to have identified Berlin, and most of the bombs exploded in open countryside. Although it was not a tactical success as a bombing mission, the first British raid had enormous strategic consequences. Hitler's fury lured Hermann Goering, the man in charge of the Luftwaffe, into making his greatest tactical error. Just as the Luftwaffe was on the point of victory over the RAF in the Battle of Britain, he switched his forces from pounding the fighter airfields and began the systematic bombing of London and other civilian targets. This blind desire for revenge gave Fighter Command the respite it needed to gain its strength, and led directly to the British victory in the Battle of Britain. The men of Bomber Command were not aware of the significance of this turning point. They were wrestling with the difficulty that the bombers then in service had experienced in reaching Berlin with a considerable bomb load and returning safely. The huge losses in British bombers caused by German fighters in the early day raids over Germany caused a switch from day to night raids. The German pilots pounding London were flying from France and could be over London in an hour. Berlin was 650 miles from England, and with the rudimentary navigation techniques at their disposal, it was difficult for the pilots to locate their targets at such an extreme range at night. The Allied bombers had to travel 650 miles by the direct route to reach their target. For the Wellingtons, Hamptons, and other aircraft that flew these earliest raids on Berlin, this was approaching their operational limits. With this knowledge, the Germans concentrated their anti-aircraft and night fighters along this route.
The Allied pilots had very great problems in locating their targets in the early part of the war, because they were bombing at night. They were therefore flying over occupied Europe, which was blacked out. They had therefore to rely for navigation upon the compass, upon taking sights from the stars, their own speed, and hoping that they knew the wind direction, because the wind could blow them off target. They had very great difficulty in finding the city that they were to attack, and they had even greater difficulty, of course, in identifying the factory or the marshalling yard in the city that they were to attack. So there were very great problems of navigation and identification. They also had growing problems, of course, from German defences. At first the searchlights and the anti-aircraft guns, but then from about 1941 onwards, the night fighters as well. So it was a very difficult business attacking Germany at night.
With the problems of navigation, aircraft initially made their way independently across Germany, depending on the use of dead reckoning, the basis of aerial navigation at that time. This required a reliable compass and an accurate reading of the drift caused by the wind to the aircraft. Precise information on wind drift was not available until later in the war. Pathfinder aircraft such as the high-flying, high-speed Mosquito were therefore designated to fly ahead of the waves of bombers to provide up-to-the-minute weather over target reports. Early navigators were forced back onto other methods to establish their positions more accurately. It was not unusual for a pilot to locate landmarks such as rivers and railway lines and fly along them to the target. Obviously, this option was not available in cloud cover.
The main focus of Allied bombing in the early years of the war was upon military targets. The British tried to bomb German oil refineries, railway marshalling yards, and war production factories. They did not directly try to target the civilian population. Many of the bombs missed, of course, and hit civilian areas, but in the early part of the war there was no particular design to attack civilians. Indeed, in the early part of the war, they would have regarded any such attack as abhorrent.
The performance of planes and crews continued to be honed during 1941, when repeated raids were made into the Ruhr. The targets were the oil refineries and power stations, so vital to the German war effort. Orders were also issued to continue the bombing campaign of Berlin. In retaliation, the German bombers did the same to London and other English cities, as the deadly game of tit-for-tat raids continued to spiral out of control. The navigation aids available to Bomber Command were improving. So, at last, was the performance of the aircraft that were to fly the missions.
They tried to solve the navigational problems by using wireless direction systems. Basically, these amounted to following a radio beam, and either a beeping noise or something like that would indicate if you had moved off the beam, or you would follow one beam and wait until another beam intersected it, and that would tell you that you were over the target. In addition, they began using early versions of radar, which was not a very good device at that time because it didn't give a very good definition of targets on the ground, cities and so forth on the ground. Perhaps the most important change that was made in order to deal with navigational problems, however, was the creation of the Pathfinder squadrons. These were skilled, elite crews, good at navigation, which went ahead of the main force to locate the target, drop flares on it and incendiaries on it to set fire to it, and thus provide both a target and an aiming point for the main force, which would then move in a few minutes later.
The introduction of the Lancaster, Halifax, and other long-range bombers meant that the extra flying range could be used to vary the approach route to the target. Consequently, the Germans were not slow to adapt their defense tactics to this new development. The early bombing raids carried out by Wellington aircraft early in the war had shown the benefit of formation flying. However, the Germans found a weakness. The fighters were directed to attack the formations from above and behind, and consequently the formations were broken up and the bombers picked off one by German night fighters. On the route to Berlin, night fighters like these were used with deadly effect. The bombers were forced to fly most of their journey over enemy territory. By now, Germany had effective radar, and this was used to direct the night fighters. One deterrent, tried with some success by the bombers, was to drop thousands of metal strips, called windows, to confuse the radar signals. Despite this, the German radar operators still had plenty of time to direct their night fighters, and many aircraft were shot down on the long return flight. A great deal of German development effort went into improving the night fighter defense force. While it made raids on Berlin and the other targets within their territory extremely hazardous, the relentless effort had its effect in other areas of the war. Despite these improved air defenses, it was the use of large formations that was to carry the bombers back to Berlin. Great success had been achieved in raids on the Ruhr and other industrial regions for this type of attack, led by the Pathfinder squadrons, in which a master bomber, in charge of the raid, flew ahead of the main bomber waves with aircraft specifically equipped to mark the target using special incendiary devices called target indicators. The de Havilland Mosquito, with its unique, nearly all-wood construction, was to become well known for fulfilling this role. Entering service in 1941, they were to excel, using their speed to evade the unwelcome attentions of the enemy defending fighters. By making use of the electronic guidance aids and accurate navigation, the Pathfinder would mark the target under the guidance of the master bomber circling high above. The master bomber would measure the accuracy of the target indicators. The master bomber could then guide the main waves of bombers accurately onto their targets. Even with these new tactics, Bomber Command struggled to get sufficient planes into the air at any one time, as the years of war were beginning to take their toll and very few pioneers were left. There was also a lack of experienced pilots and crews, as many had been killed or taken prisoner after crashing on earlier missions. Those that were left had to be spread thinly amongst the ranks of the young, enthusiastic and freshly trained crews. But help was near at hand. When the United States of America entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the resources available to Bomber Command on long-range missions increased tremendously. Not only were components, engines, and complete aircraft manufactured to British designs being brought to this country from American factories, but soon new aircraft would be seen in the sky. The Boeing Airplane Company's B-17 Fortress was to play its part in the climax of the bombing campaign on Berlin.
In theory, and in terms of propaganda put out at the time, the entry of the Americans was a considerable augmentation, because the propaganda spoke of round-the-clock bombing. The idea was that the Americans would attack in daylight, the British at night, and therefore the German defences would be stretched continuously on a 24-hour basis. In practice, it didn't quite work out like that, because really the two air forces fought independent wars and seldom consulted very much in choosing target systems adjacent to each other or attacking the same target on successive days, for example.
Air Marshal Harris, leader of Bomber Command, still believed that given sufficient aircraft backed up with an accelerated production line, he could inflict such a state of devastation on Berlin and the rest of Germany that German surrender was inevitable. In November 1943, he requested help from the Americans. "We can wreck Berlin from end to end if the Americans will come in on it. It will cost us 400 to 500 aircraft. It will cost Germany the war." The reality was to prove more difficult. 5,000 British and American aircraft would ultimately be lost, and 60,000 airmen would fall into German hands. During the winter of 1943-1944, Berlin was subject to a concentrated series of heavy attacks. The German night fighter force was at the peak of its strength and efficiency, and bomber casualties were heavy. The final phase of the Battle of Berlin alone was to cost 1,047 British aircraft. This unusual propaganda film for Germany shows scraps from British aircraft being turned into anti-aircraft guns to protect Berlin. The Americans were not ready for such long-distance missions in the autumn of 1943. It wasn't until March 1944 that they were to be seen over Berlin. By then, the Mustang long-range fighter had been developed to provide the necessary fighter escort. These fighters used the tactics that had been hard learnt in the Battle of Britain and ensured air superiority. They flew in large formations and were able to sweep the skies clean of defending aircraft by their weight of numbers. Bomber Command was at last fulfilling the purpose for which it was originally designed.
Now, the Germans had been in the habit of intercepting the American formations, which, remember, up to this point were not escorted by fighters. They were in the habit of sending up not just their good day fighters, the Focke-Wulfs and the Messerschmitts, but they also used their night fighters as an augmentation, because these fighters, though not very fast or nimble, could pick off damaged bombers, and could also, because they carried heavy armament, sit on the edge of the bomber stream, outside the range of American guns, and fire their 20mm cannon into the bomber stream. So they were in the habit of coming up to attack the bomber stream. Now, when the Mustangs encountered these planes, slow, twin-engined, and festooned with radar, they were really cold meat for them. And on some occasions, half a squadron could be shot down by the Mustangs. The effect, therefore, was that the escorting Mustangs shot down the night fighters in the daytime situation, and amongst those they shot down were the aces, because it is the case that something like 1/2 of the planes shot down at night were shot down by less than 10% of the crews. And in 1944, the Mustangs got them in about equal proportions, and so made the life of Bomber Command aircrew much safer.
The nature of that campaign was always to be a political decision. It was in an internal War Office minute of 1st of April 1941, commenting on the German invasion of Yugoslavia, that the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, first mentioned the concept of area bombing of civilian targets. In order to give support to other countries that stood against the German blitzkrieg, he proposed using the weapon of offensive bombing. He wrote, "Our objective should be to do the maximum damage and destruction to the populated areas, as a demonstration of that ruthless force which we shall have to employ against Germany sooner or later, if we are to get the full moral effects out of our air defense."
There was a considerable political background to this decision. In 1942, bombing was the only way that the British could attack Germany, so they had to bomb. But they had found in 1939 that they couldn't bomb by day, and in 1941 they found that their night attacks were tremendously inaccurate. It was found by identifying bomb bursts from photographs that only one bomber in 3 was bombing within 5 miles of the designated target, which effectively meant that the bombing was having very little effect at all. In other words, they had discovered that night precision bombing did not work. With day bombing out as well, the only recourse left was to go to night area attack. It was that or stop bombing Germany altogether. And that was politically unacceptable in 1942 for all kinds of reasons, not least, of course, because the Russians in 1942 were screaming for a second front to take the pressure off them, and the only way that Churchill could show that the British were assisting the Russians was the bombing attack on German cities. So there was a very considerable political background to this, but the essential point is that the British had no choice. It was a question of night area bombing or no bombing at all.
The Americans in particular were always uneasy about the morality of area bombing against civilian targets. The ruthless Air Marshal Harris was less queasy. Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca in January 1943 to discuss how to bring about the unconditional surrender of Germany. A memorandum was issued at the time of their meeting, instructing both the British and United States bomber commands that their primary objective was the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system. The list concluded with other targets of great importance either from the political or military point of view. Berlin was therefore designated as a target of great importance from a political point of view. As the war moved towards its inevitable conclusion, Berlin was raided again and again by flights of masked bombers. On their raids, they were accompanied by fighters who, using the tactics of the Allies in the Battle of Britain, ensured complete air superiority, thus carrying the war into the heartland of the enemy. Therefore, Operation Overlord was ordered and began on D-Day.
Bombing was the only effective way the British could attack Germany for many years of the war, and that area bombing was the only form of bombing that was possible for Bomber Command to achieve any results. The situation began to change towards the end of the war, because by then the British and the Americans had amassed a truly frightening bomber force. The British had something like 1,000 heavy four-engine bombers, mostly Lancasters. The Americans had something like 2,000 B-17 flying fortresses, and there was virtually no German opposition to speak of. This immense force of bombers had matured in tactics, in marking targets, in accuracy, in the whole organization of raids. The result is that by the early part of 1945, indeed by late 1944, Bomber Command and the Americans were capable of in one raid of inflicting the sort of damage that one atomic bomb could do.
By the time of the massed bombing raids on Berlin, many of the aircraft being flown by British Bomber Command were of American design and manufacture. Chief amongst these was the Boeing B-17. Hundreds of these aircraft were used by the RAF in Coastal Command and as special bomber support aircraft. The aircraft was designed to a U.S. Army Air Corps specification issued in 1934. This called for a multi-engine anti-shipping bomber. Boeing's design used 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines to carry its bomb load higher and faster than other designs. While a huge financial risk for the Boeing company, the aircraft that they produced was to go on to be a giant amongst combat aircraft. This aircraft was to be the first weapon of the US 8th Bomber Command in England. They were to use it for 3 difficult years of daylight strategic bombing raids in Europe. The combat version of the B-17 produced included the type XB-40, which carried extra defensive guns to help protect the main bomb groups, as well as a reconnaissance version, executive transports, and lifeboat-carrying air-sea rescue versions. The total production run of this type of aircraft amounted to 12,731. The other major American aircraft in British service was the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation Model 32, known as the B-24, the Liberator. Conceived 5 years after the B-17, it did not improve on the older bomber's performance. In the hands of an average pilot, there was less stability and control was significantly inferior. It had a curious layout, dictated by the slender wing placed above the tail bomb bays. This wing contributed to the efficiency in cruising flight. The Liberator had a longer range than any other land plane of its day. The early versions that were supplied to the RAF were deemed not to be combat-proof, and were therefore used as transport on the Atlantic return ferry service. However, later versions proved acceptable and saw service in the Middle East and for Coastal Command. They enabled the RAF to close the mid-Atlantic gap and to hunt U-boat packs in areas previously out of aircraft range. By the end of the war, Bomber Command once more had at its disposal the most up-to-date aircraft, capable of delivering the tasks that were required of them. In essence, the tactic had remained unchanged from the inception of the RAF at the end of the First World War. The philosophy of Bomber Command was to take the war deep into the heartland of a potential enemy. This tactic was seen at its most effective in the mass bombing of Dresden and the resulting firestorm. Even at the time, questions were raised about the morality of this course of action. Following an off-the-record briefing at the War Office, an Association Press correspondent filed a story that, in part, stated that the Allied air chiefs had made the long-awaited decision to adopt deliberate terror bombing of German population centers as a ruthless expedient to hastening Hitler's doom. The story was denied within 5 hours, but it was too late. It broke in the American newspapers and caused considerable embarrassment on each side of the Atlantic. Questions were even asked in the British House of Commons.
But I think it has to be said that in 1943-1944, when area bombing was in full spate, the mass of the British population would not have been upset if the truth had been told to them. After all, the Germans had directly attacked them with no qualms. And secondly, the war simply had to be won against the Nazis. And if it took night area bombing to win it, then unfortunately this would go ahead.
Air Marshal Harris was himself drawn into the argument. He did not point out that it was not his decision alone, but one taken and shared by those at a much higher political level. He did not remind those who questioned the action that this had been and still was the role assigned to Bomber Command. His answer was much more clear. Dresden was a mass of munitions works, an intact government center, and key transportation center to the east. It is now none of these things. The aircraft of Bomber Command had carried out their orders and completed their mission. The role of the bomber is still crucial to today's aerial warfare tactics. The precision laser-guided bombs delivered from modern high-speed jets may have replaced the massive payloads of high-explosive and incendiary bombs dropped from the Lancasters and Wellingtons of the Second World War, but the job of Bomber Command remains the same: to destroy material and resources vital to an enemy's war effort, even though it is located far from the front line of the fighting. The actions that were carried out by Bomber Command during the Second World War have ensured Bomber Command its lasting place in the history of aviation warfare.